Hey everybody, so we were just talking about how the reading assignment for today was Hume's Enquiry Concerning Human Understanding, sections 1 through 3. The entirety of the inquiry goes through sections 1 through 5, and there's a reading quiz on sections 1 through 5, but that's not due until Thursday, where the reading assignment due Thursday is to finish reading the rest of Hume's Enquiry, sections 4 and 5. Tuesday? Did I say Thursday? Yeah, Tuesday. The 13th of February, the day before Valentine's Day. So if you finish that quiz before class today, well, then you're ahead. That's good. If you try to finish the quiz without actually reading sections 4 and 5, that's a strange thing to try to do. If you went ahead and read sections 4 and 5 so that you could take the quiz, again, you're ahead a little bit. And if you finish the quiz but you didn't do all of your attempts, good news. You got more attempts left over still. Is there anybody that exhausted their 3 attempts and would really like one more? All right. I think I'll probably add one more it's all right. You know, there are all kinds of reasons why you might be late to class. We heard today about somebody who got stabbed. Before we get into Hume's Enquiry, sections 1 through 3, and I have relatively modest goals for that today. It's not going to be super condensed. Our last meeting was pretty condensed. In previous semesters, that had been 2 meetings, and I smushed it into one. I didn't quite finish it. There was some really interesting stuff that was planned for the end that we didn't get around to, and I want to wrap that up first. And this has to do with Locke's essay concerning human understanding. I've made fun of this already once, right? Yeah, that we have like an essay from Locke, an essay concerning human understanding from David Hume. We have an enquiry concerning human understanding. With Locke, where things get really, really interesting, and I think in a really cool way that we can hand off to Hume. We're not going to get to the ways that this enters into Hume's analysis until our next meeting on Tuesday, the 13th. But with Locke, this has to do with his account of complex ideas. So Locke was talking about complex ideas. And we had established that Locke had established, or Locke claimed, or the model or the theory that he's pitching here is graceful. Is that there are 3 ways that complex ideas can get made. Refresh my memory. What are these 3 ways? Relations. Well, that's getting into the different kinds of complex ideas. 3 ways in which they're made. You can articulate a relationship between 2 ideas to make a complex idea. Combining into a unity. And then the last one was? Abstracting or separating. We're going to get a similar sort of model from Hume. In many ways, an awful lot of the stuff that we're going to do with Hume today, the stuff that happens in sections 1 through 3 of his Enquiry, well, he does things in some subtly different ways than Locke does, for the most part. I don't know if you guys were having some deja vu reading sections 1 through 3 of Hume. You might have been thinking to yourself, this sounds an awful lot like Locke. A little kind of twist here and there, a couple of places where he moved some things around. So, let me start off by saying that, sections 1 through 3 of Hume's Enquiry are really similar to the stuff that's going on with Locke. I'm going to do my best when we start talking about it to exaggerate the differences, because those are going to be the interesting parts. So we're going to get some kind of notion about how, it's not going to be complex ideas, but there's going to be ways that ideas get related to one another. That's going to pop up for Hume today. These are the 3 ways that Locke says complex ideas get made. 3 activities of the mind in the construction of complex ideas. And this is key to his account of what complex ideas are like. Simple ideas just kind of come to you. You get them passively presented to your understanding. But the complex ideas you make, they're part of an activity of the mind to create these complex ideas, either by relating 2 ideas together, by combining stuff into a unity, or by abstracting or separating. And we also talked about how maybe there's some confusion about how it is that I can perform this activity of abstraction to make complex ideas from simple ideas. How do I abstract a part out of a simple idea if the simple idea supposedly has no parts? Yeah.
Did you argue that
Yeah. So good. So just in case the microphone didn't pick that up, excellent point. That this is maybe the way to think about it. Like we take things sometimes as a simple unity. So take anything, right? Anything. The marker is a thing. A tree is a thing. I am a thing. You are a thing. Like we are like independently, and perhaps we can get a simple idea of just like one unified thing, but then in turning our attention to it, we can start breaking it up into pieces. So there's an awful lot of like this kind of activity that Locke is talking about, where he seems to be maybe even, I wouldn't say playing fast and loose, but we get this impression that these ideas aren't fixed, that you can kind of come back to it and look at it in another way. You can attend to different aspects of the idea, and it will present itself in kind of like a new fashion. What was simple now reveals itself to be complex, and we're abstracting one piece of it away. 3 different ways of creating complex ideas, 3 activities of the mind, and then 3 kinds of complex ideas. And those were? I'll get you started. Relations, substances, and then the last one? Modes. And at first glance, these line up pretty well. The big clue here is going to be relations. Like, some complex ideas are made by relating 2 or more ideas together. And there are some complex ideas that we call relations. And you're like, I wonder how you get those relations. Is it by relating to them? Yeah, okay. Yeah, that makes sense. And then when we start thinking about substances and combining into a unity, we had some conversation about what exactly this word substance means, and I hopefully impressed upon you that that's a long conversation to get into what substance means. But it seems fairly clear that Locke is thinking of it in much the same way that lots of other folks are thinking of it, in a very similar way to the way that David Hume is going to think about substance, as this way that things are combined into a unity. A substance is an independently existing thing, or it's the thingliness of things. It's that by virtue of which a thing can be an existing thing. And sometimes we think of substance as stuff, as like the matter that kind of underlies all of the primary and secondary qualities that impress themselves on the senses, right? So you look at this marker, you see some black, you see some white, you maybe get some impression of shiny, maybe even you get like shape, and maybe even you get like 3-dimensional figure, like, oh, it's round, like all of these things. All of those things that you perceive, all of those sensations that you're getting from this marker, all belong to one thing. By virtue of what do all of those sensations hang together? And the answer is, well, substance. Now, we could take an approach to substance where we would say, like, all right, here's the substance for all things. If I was a materialist, for example, that was my metaphysical position, I could say I'm a substance monist. There's only one kind of substance, and it's matter. So the stuff that like makes everything hang together for everything is matter or material. That ends up being, in many ways, a kind of an unsatisfactory account of substance because it doesn't get to this question of like what makes this marker this marker. I know it has matter, but this also has matter. So what makes this one thing and this some other thing? So this question of substance is a little bit complicated, but it seems like it has to do with the way that things hang together into a unity, such that like when I take the marker and I put it behind my back and I bring it back again, you maybe think to yourself, if you're older than 2.5 years old or so, hey, I bet that's the same thing, right? Babies don't, like really young babies, and idiots perhaps, if we're following in Locke's way of talking about this, perhaps don't get this. They don't have object permanence, right? They don't have like a concept of thing. This is a really, and if you're kind of wondering like, how can you get in the world without a concept of thing? Well, you don't do very well without a concept of thing. You need somebody else to take care of you and feed you and change your diapers and stuff like that. You can't be left on your own to navigate the world. But maybe this is something that we do create. It's a complex idea. The marker is a complex idea. And I assemble it out of like all of the different sensations. So this is one way of thinking about a substance. We're going to talk about another important substance, which is you, and what makes you you as opposed to somebody else, and what keeps you one thing over time. And then we have this mode business. And modes they seem to be, at least in the way that Locke is describing them, created through this activity of abstraction or separation. And specifically, it's abstracting something away that can't stand on its own, that can't be an independently existing thing. So, for example, redness. redness seems to be the sort of thing that, like, according to Locke, and I think according to a lot of our intuitions too, I'm seeing some heads nodding, and, like, some people who are just like, oh, wait, what are we talking about now? All right, so, like, redness, all by itself, seems to not be an independently existing thing. It's a very Aristotelian idea, too. Maybe you need matter and form together. That redness, Plato would be like, redness is, like, that's an independently existing thing, perhaps. It's the form of all red things. And it exists apart from all of the particular red things. In fact, the particular red things are only red insofar as they participate in the form of all redness. And Aristotle goes, nah, that's not how it works. You have form, and you have matter, and they're separable in thought. You can abstract them apart from one another. Perhaps the same way that you can abstract the right side of something from the left side of something, or the head side of a coin from the tail side of a coin. But you can't actually separate them from one another. And you might think to yourself, like, I'll cut that coin right across the middle. Now you've just got two coins with a head side and a tail side, right? Or a top and a bottom, as it were, right? These are things that always seem to come together. Matter and form seem to always come together. Redness and, like, red things. Like, you have to have a red thing in order for redness to exist. This is the way that Locke seems to be thinking of modes. All of these ways that I can get an idea that I've abstracted from another idea, and that actually can't exist all by itself. It's something that's separable in thought only. How are we doing so far? Okay on this? Good. All right. The three examples of relations, substances, and modes that I want to mention real quick before we start getting into Hume are ones that Locke makes incredibly rich hay out of. There's one that we're going to talk about. I'll mention it, but I'm not going to talk about it much because we're going to spend so much time talking about it with David Hume. And that's one of his prime examples for talking about relations, and that's cause and effect. And do we get a sense, by the way, how cause and effect seems like a relation? Maybe the two imply one another, right? I could just think of cause. But the idea of cause is articulating a relationship between something and something else. Same with effect. Like, cause implies effect. Effect implies a cause. And a cause and effect, that one idea of cause/effect, seems to be a relationship between two things. The rooster crowed. The sun came up. The rooster crowing caused the sun to come up. I get it. Okay, that makes sense. That's not a very good causal inference. But we get how that works, right? Two ideas that are linked together in some sort of relationship of cause and effect. Keep an eye on that. Not literally, because I'll erase it at some point. But, like, keep this in your mind. This is going to be a huge, huge deal for David Hume. Cause and effect is one of the notions that, like, causes everything to come crashing down. In terms of substances, the topic that Locke brings up, and this example that he uses to talk about substance in a really interesting way, is personal identity. Which I mentioned already as, like, you are one thing. Are you not one thing? Descartes said you were one thing. As a matter of fact, he said you are indivisible. This is one of the things that makes res cogitans different than res extensa. Res extensa is totally divisible. Margaret Cavendish agreed with that too. Matter is divisible. But mind, not so much. If I divide your mind in half, that's not you anymore. Like, you are like one whole thing. Just one thing. There might be many different profiles of you, but something unifies you together. The real trick for this is trying to figure out how it is that, like, you maintain some sort of unity over time. Because a long, long time ago, I didn't even have the same material in my body anymore. Presumably, all of this stuff has been changed out as cells kind of die and then get repaired and replaced, and I eat food. And, like, when I was little, I ate food and I grew. But I keep eating food and I don't keep growing. This is like matter is getting exchanged. And I have new experiences. When I was young, I didn't think the same things, not the exact same things that I do now. But there's something about me as a 5-year-old, me now, and me at the end of today's lecture. Notice I called them all me. They're all me, right? And same for you. They're all you. There was you at the beginning of the semester. There's you right now. There's going to be you when you graduate. There's going to be, like, there was you when you had that, like, birthday party at the bowling alley. and you ate too much ice cream and you threw up and you were embarrassed. Like all of these things, like they're all part of you. What holds them all together? What makes them all you? Substance. Yeah, but what is that? On what hinges this kind of unity of the self? Josh, you had your hand up. Mm-hmm. This is totally, yeah. This could be a Theseus' ship problem, especially if we say that the substance for personal identity is matter. We're going to run into a Theseus' ship problem. For those of you who are not aware, Theseus was the guy who fought the Minotaur. If you've heard this story, like there was like Crete and there was a Minotaur and like people, like young virgins were sacrificed, and Theseus, the young prince, went and killed the Minotaur. And then he came back. People usually like lose track of this story after the Minotaur gets killed. It ends pretty sad. Theseus comes back to his home, where his father told him, when you come back, if you're alive, make sure you change the sails from the black sails to the white sails so that I know that like you made it and that you lived. And tell your crew that if they come back without you to like put the black sails up. Theseus, just in a boneheaded move, forgets to change the sails, comes back in with the black sails. His father sees them, and before the ship can come into the harbor, throws himself off a cliff and kills himself. Tragic misunderstanding. Total Greek tragedy stuff, right? Simple misunderstanding, somebody kills themselves in the end, or like jabs things in their eyes, or like whatever. Yeah, Corbin.
So I might be thinking of a completely different analogy.
I didn't even actually get to the philosophically interesting part of that. Let me just kind of do that real quick, and then you can tell me the analogy. The issue with this, so the ship was very famous, and was like kept in the harbor, but it was made of wood, and wood rots over time. So the ship would start to rot, and then the people were like, we don't want a rotten ship, so they would replace the rotten pieces. You replace a couple of boards, is that still Theseus' ship? You replace a couple more, you see where this is going? Replace a couple more, until like there's rotten wood on the pier in a big pile, and then there's this brand new ship over here with all brand new wood. Which of these is Theseus' ship? Is it the pile of stuff over here that like went to Crete and back, but it's not really a boat anymore? Or is it this boat? And when did it turn? If you say like the new thing is not Theseus' ship, that's a copy of Theseus' ship. The real Theseus' ship is over there in a pile, or it's destroyed and it doesn't exist anymore. If you think that this ship that's been repaired over time until like it has none of the same material as it started out with, if you think that it's not the same ship as it started out with, when did the change happen? Did it happen when the first piece got replaced? Did it happen when the last piece got replaced? Did it happen when 50% of the pieces got replaced? And it seems silly to pinpoint it in any one place. This is a species of like a whole bunch of different problems called Sorites problems. But yeah, Corbin, you said this reminded you of another example.
You pretty much described it.
Okay.
The thought experiment is basically like, if you take apart every single part of a ship and replace every part of a ship, is it still the same ship?
Yeah, this is the Theseus ship problem. Sometimes this is talked about in, I mentioned this word Sorites, the Sorites paradox. Sorites is Greek for a pile. So it's this question of like, if I have a grain of sand and I put it on the table, is that a pile of sand? No. 2 grains of sand. 2 grains ain't a pile. 3 grains of sand. That's not a pile. It becomes a pile at some point, right? How many grains of sand does it take? This is like various sorts of confusions regarding vague predication or something like that. It's not really clear where pile starts and stops. It's not really clear where Theseus' ship starts and stops. It's not really clear maybe where you start and stop, except, this is totally clear. I'm me. And all of the various versions of me have all been me. The way that Locke inflects this and so, offers a context for us to think about personal identity in a very, very specific way is to say, you're held responsible for shit that you did in the past. If you murdered somebody and the police come to your door, or if you stabbed somebody with a box cutter. If you stab somebody with a box cutter and then the police come to your door and they're like, hey, you're the one what stabbed the other person with the box cutter. Could you say, I'm a completely different person now. I've, eaten a sandwich since then. I watched a TV show since then. That's not me. But it seems like you are responsible for the things that you did in the past. So there's got to be, in order to make that work, you've got to be the same person as the person who did the bad things that you're now responsible for. Or perhaps the good things that you're now responsible for and you get praised for instead of blamed for or punished. So what's this all about? And I think we mentioned, Locke hangs this on memory. He says, your capacity to have memories is what pulls your, like, all these different versions of you at T1 and T2 and T3 and all throughout, like, the various points in time throughout your life. It's memory that holds these things together, which raises some interesting questions, which is, what if you lose your memories? Are you the same person now? And Locke's like, no, you're not. And maybe this is a little bit intuitive as well, because if you woke up tomorrow morning and the police were banging on your door and they said, you killed somebody last night, and you said, no, I didn't. And they said, yeah, you totally did. And you're like, I have no memory of this. And they show you the video of you murdering somebody, and you're like, I have no recollection of that at all. Is there a part of you that's thinking to yourself like, that wasn't me. I'm not responsible for that. If I don't remember it, I'm not responsible. When I was younger, I had a lot of broken bones there was a period in my life where I broke a lot of bones. And one time when I had a broken wrist and they needed to reset it, instead of giving me a painkiller they gave me some painkillers, but instead of like a big time anesthetic, they gave me an amnesiac. And I'm not sure exactly what the theory behind this was, or like if they still do this sort of thing. But they doped me up a little so I was a little punchy and goofy. And then they gave me this thing so that I just couldn't make any new memories. And then they reset my broken arm. And my dad tells me that I made an awful face when they did that, and I made an awful noise, and I said some unflattering things about the orderly's mother. But I don't remember any of that stuff. Which raises this question, did it happen to me? And Locke seems to suggest no. No, that didn't happen to you. He has this phrase that he kind of like uses a couple of times. Socrates awake and Socrates asleep are not the same person. If Socrates asleep is a person at all, it's not the same person as Socrates awake. And if you believe in like reincarnation or something like that, and you claim that you have memories of like your past life when you were Cleopatra, then you and Cleopatra are the same person. And it's always somebody famous and powerful. It's always some like great person. It's never like Hitler. Like I used to be Hitler. But if you're the reincarnation of Hitler and you share memories with Hitler, John Locke would be like, you're responsible for all the Hitler stuff because you are Hitler. Yeah, Corbin.
Couldn't you also fabricate memories of another person and then eventually believe them to be real?
So this is one of the issues for a memory theory of personal identity is like, so what about false memories? Is there anybody here who like has personal experience with a false memory? Like you have a memory and it's vivid and clear, as vivid and clear as memories get. But like you're pretty sure like that didn't actually happen. I've got at least one of these that involves something bad that me and my friends did, and then we lied about it, and we told the lie so many times. I can barely remember what actually happened now. I only remember the lie. As far as I'm concerned, like the lie is more real than what actually happened. Anybody who's done work with eyewitness testimony, especially eyewitness testimony with children, knows memories are not reliable at all. You can get somebody to swear up and down that they remember things that never happened, especially impressionable people, especially children. You get child, like start them off like real easy. Be like, hey, remember that time that we went to the mall? And you're like, you've never been to the mall with them, and they might be like, we went to the mall. And you're like, yeah, start describing it. We went to this store, and we went to this store, and we went to this store, and maybe. Keep doing it over and over and over again. When we went to the mall, and add all kinds of things to it. There were alligators in the fountain. Remember the alligators? And they'd be like, yeah, there were alligators. They'll start believing that it actually happened. So false memories is a real issue for a memory theory of consciousness. There are also some other issues, which are like the fact that memories don't last forever, and you forget them. So what if, like, at T1, you have memories A, B, C, and D, and then at T2, you forgot some of those. You have A and B, but you don't have C and D anymore, but you've got some new memories, E and F. And then at T3, you've got memory E, F, G, H. Are these the same person? Well, they share some memories. So according to a memory theory, yeah. Yeah, they have overlapping memories, so yeah, they must be the same person. Are these the same person? Yeah, memory E and F, they share memories. So yeah, they're the same person. Are these the same person? T1 and T3? They don't share any memories. Oh, shit, that's messed up. This is the same as this, and this is the same as this, but this isn't the same as this? That's not how identity works. If A is equal to B and B is equal to C, A has to be equal to C. So this gets into trouble. There are all kinds of weird little hiccups and attempts to rescue these throughout the history of philosophy, or the history of philosophy after Locke, to try to rescue a memory theory. And there are little tweaks that you can do here and there. These days, I think people don't hang it all on memories. It's some other kind of psychological continuity. It's memories plus attitudes plus emotional proclivities plus intentions and stuff like that. It's a whole kind of a mushy network. But still this idea of if there's a radical break in personality from one moment to the other, such that you wake up with complete amnesia and you used to like pizza but now you hate it. Yeah, Jason Bourne kind of scenario. We might say, yeah, brand new person. So this personal identity thing gives you some sense of how it is that substance starts to kind of play out in some weird and interesting ways. But also, if you've been paying close attention to what's going on here, perhaps you recognize that this whole business of personal identity, while it was about unifying all of the various versions of you throughout time, it's also articulating kind of a relationship between all of those versions of you throughout time. And it's also a way of thinking about maybe what causes all of these things to belong to the same thing, or how come I think of myself as the same as earlier. And maybe even we're getting into this idea that there's a me that underlies all of the experiences. Maybe I'm starting to abstract something away from it. Maybe it's a substance that can stand on its own, or maybe not. Maybe it's like redness. It doesn't without any thoughts or experiences, there's no underlying me. If we take who I am to be some kind of Cartesian thinking self, if I'm a thinking self that's never thunk any thoughts, is there a me? You guys maybe have some sense of where Locke would go with this. A thinking self that hasn't thunk any thoughts? That's not a thinking self. That's darn near a contradiction. So these are kind of weird and mushy. The modes that he talks about, one that he spends an awful lot of time talking about is power. And then he talks about a very specific kind of power, the kind of power that's available in the mind, certain kinds of mental faculties, powers of the mind, things that the mind can do. Power, he eventually breaks down, or initially, right off the bat, he breaks down power as the capacity for change. And he talks about power in a passive way and in an active way. You can have a power to be changed, to passively accept some sort of change. And he refers to that as a form of power. Or you could have a sort of an active power. And if you're thinking about activity and passivity of powers of the mind, and you're that seems a little bit familiar, it's because we talked about this at our last meeting, and we said that sensation, all ideas come from two places, right? What are they? Sensation and reflection. And sensation was a passive faculty of the mind, and reflection was an active capacity of the mind. So we're thinking about mental powers, the things that minds can do, thinking about them in active and passive ways, and eventually he gets around to talking about the will. This is the active part of the mind. This is the part of the mind that doesn't just kind of sit back and go with the flow. The will is what kind of steps in and says no, we're going to zig instead of zag. So the mind has some sort of active power, and it seems to have to do with the will, and this brings us to this conversation of free will, and whether or not anybody has it. And Locke, not being one to shy away from a difficult question, says, yeah, let's take on this question of free will. What does he say? You guys read this, and you even took a quiz. I know it was a while ago, but what does Locke say about free will? Is there free will? It's tricky. No. But at the same time, yeah, kind of. He says that there's no free will. But there's no free will because that's an idea that doesn't make any sense. Locke would be free will? That's nonsense. The will isn't free. You're free, though. If you're like, oh, I have no free will, so like I don't get to make any choices. He's like, whoa, hold on. No, you're free. It's just that your will's not free. This is almost like a category mistake that gets made. In trying to think of the will as free, Locke is saying like, nah, you're kind of screwing everything up. Just think of yourself as free. And here's all free means to Locke. He says, all that free means is you're able to do what you want. It's a little bit more complicated than that, but not much more complicated. He uses a really fascinating thought experiment by which like somebody is brought into a locked room while they're sleeping. You guys remember reading that passage? So Locke has the locked room. The locked room. Locke's locked room. Where he says, all right, we put a person in this locked room while they're sleeping. And there's another person in there with them. And that person's a long-lost friend that they haven't seen in a long time. And all the doors get locked. So, like, you can't get out that way, you can't get out that way, you can't get out. And there are no windows, and the person can't get out. And the person wakes up in this locked room, and they immediately see their friend, and they're like, oh, awesome! Let's start catching up. Did they stay in that room of their own free will? Was that a freely chosen decision to stay in the room? And what Locke points out is that like they couldn't have left if they tried. Like they were going to stay in the room. There was no way for them to not stay in the room. Despite the fact that there was no way for them to leave the room, could we say that they freely chose to stay in the room? And Locke is like, yeah, totally. And all this really is the difference between whether or not like what happened was what you wanted, or was it not what you wanted? Or was it maybe outside of what you wanted altogether? Aristotle does a similar sort of a thing. We usually refer to this as a compatibilist approach to free will. And the two things that are supposedly compatible in a compatibilist approach are, we're saying, it could very well be that all of your actions are predetermined. And even if that were true, you could still have freedom. You could still make free choices. And basically this has to do with just this question of like, was what happened what you wanted to happen? I like to think of it sometimes as if you're, let's say, you ever go tubing down a river? Or like canoeing or something? You've like gone down a river that has a current? Let's say you're going down a river and the current is fast and there's a branch in the river. And the current is going super duper fast down one branch and kind of slow down the other branch. And as you're going down in your inner tube or your canoe or whatever, you think to yourself, I want to go that way, but the current's too strong and you can't. So as you're paddling frantically to go this way, you get drawn by the current this way. And you couldn't really help yourself. There's that scenario, or there's also the possibility that you come upon the same fork and you look at these two options and you look at this one and you go like, that's the one that I want. And instead of trying to paddle your way this way and to like fight against it, you're just like, yeah, let's do it. You sit back and enjoy it, or you paddle to like go faster towards like this thing that you were going to do. And some folks would say, no matter what you did, you were going to end up going down this branch of the river. But a compatibilist like Locke would say, yeah, but in one of those you got what you wanted and in one of those you didn't. One of those you were brought down this branch of the river against your will. And in the other one you were brought down this branch of the river according to your will. And there are some things that happen to you that have nothing to do with your will. Like I just recapped this pen. The pen had no will about it one way or another. It wasn't a free choice for this pen to be recapped. So there are things that are kind of non-willing. There are things that are unwilling. Like when you get pulled down the side of the river that you didn't want to go towards, or when your older brother pins you down and grabs your hand and says, like, stop hitting yourself, stop hitting yourself, stop hitting yourself. And you're like, I don't want to hit myself. I'm trying to stop hitting myself, but I can't stop hitting. Like, that's unwilling, right? That's against your will. Are you hitting yourself? Yes, I suppose. But you're doing it against your own will, as opposed to the person who wants to hit themselves and is freely choosing to hit themselves. Locke says, yeah, we can have freedom, just not freedom of the will. The will is how you determine what it is that you want to do. And whether you get what you want, that has to do with whether or not you're free or constrained. If you want to like try to back the freedom up and say like, yeah, but was I free to choose whatever I want? Locke is going to say, like, you're being greedy now. Like, you're free. You're free to, like, choose things. If you want to, like, choose what you choose on top of that, this seems like we're kind of like setting ourselves up for an infinite regress. Oh, you can choose what you choose, but can you choose what you choose, what you choose? Oh, can you choose what you choose, what you choose, what you choose? Locke says, like, one choice is enough for freedom. We don't need to make it more complicated than that. So he offers, like, a really fascinating account of free will here. But again, one of the things that starts to kind of get all mushy here in this discussion of power and free will and personal identity and cause and effect, all these examples through which these ideas of relations, substances, and modes, these three kinds of complex ideas, they blur together. And you can catch Locke talking about ways in which you can think of powers as relations. You can think of free will as kind of like getting at some idea of substance. You can think of each of these things in the terms of the other. And sometimes he refers to these as confused ideas. But kind of coming back to this kind of trope in Locke's thought, especially in the essay, there seems to be this function of like how it is that you're approaching the idea. Any idea could present itself or could be taken in a variety of different ways. And these tidy categories of relations, substances, and modes start to kind of like mush together. And Locke seems aware of this, and maybe to not even have much of a problem with it. I mention these because things like cause and effect, personal identity, free will a little less, but the idea of power, and the ideas of minds, and whether or not these are all distinct things, this is going to be a big, big issue for David Hume in section 4 of his Enquiry. I'm just trying to get it set up. Questions about this Locke stuff before we jump into the Hume stuff? Yes?
So does Locke believe in fate?
Does Locke believe in fate? He doesn't weigh in on this. I'm kind of under the impression that he doesn't necessarily believe in fate. But he also seems to say, like, even if there was fate, that wouldn't be an impediment to freedom.
Because you can choose like whether you're happy or
Yeah. Yeah, you could either embrace your fate or try to fight your fate. And if you try to fight your fate, then your fate is unwilling. Or your fate is experienced in an unwilling way. If you embrace it, then your fate is something that you choose. It's consistent with your will. Yep.
Does he ever consider the prospect that being able to resist your will or fate, I suppose, is part of free will? Because I imagine if you didn't have free will, you would never question why you wanted anything. You say, I want this just because I want it. That's just the way things go.
Yeah, you're getting into the territory that he kind of criticizes. You're like, you want your will to be free. Locke is saying your will can get satisfied. And when your will is satisfied, you get to freely choose what happens. You want to back it up even more, though, and say, like, the things that I choose, or like what my will decides to set its sights on, I want that to be free, too. And Locke's like, maybe that's a thing, maybe it's not. But it seems like you're kind of going beyond this question of, like, what it is that we want when we ask, are people free? Can they make choices? Do they have the power to make choices? Yeah, Will.
So it seems though kind of like manipulation isn't really a bad thing though, according to this definition, because like if someone like very subtly like manipulates, like when you ask like for a suggestion on something, and then like they super slyly like suggest these two options, but you should probably do this one because this other one's terrible, then that's not really a bad thing because you ended up like, all right, well then I definitely want to do this other one. So
If you got to do what you wanted,
yeah.
then you were free. Yeah.
So then the other person did like, there's nothing wrong with that though, it seems like, because they...
If there was something wrong with that, it wouldn't be because it subverts your freedom. It would be for another reason. Yep. Kant's going to have something slightly different to say about this. Yeah.
It seems like all these early modern philosophers are stuck with word games, and that's the only reason they can't come to any concrete conclusions.
That's a bit of a reduction of a couple of hundred years of thought. You wouldn't be the first one to suggest that perhaps all of philosophy is caught in word games. Wittgenstein kind of said a similar thing, and because of this, most philosophical problems are in fact pseudo-problems. This is actually going to be something that, like Hume himself might be sympathetic to that idea, that there's an awful lot of philosophy that's just It's just playing with words. So if you're thinking about these early modernists, well, not David Hume, actually. He maybe is on your side here. I will say that they're writing, right? And I don't know how you write. I write with words. Do you write with words?
Right.
All right, so this is all going to have to do with words. Because that's just kind of the nature of how we communicate. It might go deeper than that. This might be the nature of how we think, too. That we think in terms of words. This is a Sapir-Whorf thesis for those of you who are familiar with these sorts of things. That you can't think without language. And in a different language, you would think different kinds of thoughts. So, perhaps language is necessary. And Locke is definitely sympathetic to that. Some of the stuff that he has to say about how general concepts get made and how language works is a big extension of this conversation about complex ideas. Locke is trying to explain how it is that one's mind does work. And he says our minds work predominantly through the application of language. He wouldn't be the first one on that one either. Aristotle's all over this as well. So, is it word games? Perhaps. This sounds maybe unnecessarily deflationary. It's just word games. It involves words. Is it just a game? It's how we figure shit out. Now, if you think that this is a fancy trick, that's you just found a way to talk as if there's freedom when there's really not freedom, you wouldn't be alone on that. A lot of folks find compatibilism to be a little unsatisfying. They're but I want bigger freedom. I want capital L liberty. I want to make I want a completely different sort of metaphysical kind of cause. There's all the normal natural causes of the world, shit bouncing into one another, there's that cause and how that works, and all the other natural causes, and if you light something on fire, it burns. And all of these things are once the cause happens, the effect has to happen. And once the initial conditions for the world are set up, it's got to unfold in a certain way. There's no other alternatives for it. But perhaps if what you want is aside from those kinds of causes, there's this other kind of cause that only minds can do. Only agents are capable of this radically different sort of free will causation, where nothing leads up to this cause. I just kind of arbitrarily, maybe apropos of nothing that came before, I make a choice to do this rather than this. If you want that, then you're not going to be able to get it from Locke. It's not that kind of freedom. It's not a radically libertarian approach to free will. Yeah.
Do you ever situations where, I'm going to try to say this the best I can, the chooser perceives both choices as equal?
The chooser perceives both choices as being equal?
The chooser perceives both choices as equal.
I can't think of any case that he addresses exactly about that. Plenty of philosophers who did get involved in sort of decision theory type stuff have addressed these exact sorts of cases. But Locke wouldn't be my first place to turn on that sort of thing. If you're interested in that, catch me after class or in office hours sometime. We can talk about people who do talk about it in more interesting ways. All right. So that was the cleanup on Locke that I wanted to do today. The other stuff that we got to do today, that we've got about 30 minutes for now, so a little bit of a race against the clock, is to talk about David Hume. David Hume, the great big Scotsman, and his Enquiry Concerning Human Understanding. Written in 1748. David Hume was born, I think, 1711, is that right? Yeah, 1711, and then he died in the momentous year 1776. Locke died 1704, I think, so David Hume is just right on the heels of Locke. Locke's essay concerning human understanding was 1689, 1690. So we can see we're talking roughly 50 years later. So pretty close, but definitely the next generation of thinker here from David Hume. David Hume is a boss, by the way. Make no mistake. David, when I was talking about Princess Elizabeth, I said some philosophers are ninjas where they just kind of come in real quiet and you think they're being friendly and saying nothing surprising, and all of a sudden your Achilles heel just got sliced by a samurai sword. And you're how did that happen? David Hume is totally one of these guys. And he is renowned in like a wide variety of contexts too. Not just as a philosopher. In his day, he was best known for writing the most comprehensive and most well-respected history of England that there was around. So he was known primarily as an historian. He got involved in like some statescraft type stuff. We won't read him in his political philosophy stuff because he was more of like a politician than a political philosopher. But he's huge, even to this day, not just on the metaphysics and epistemology stuff that he works out in the Enquiry on Human Understanding. He's still well respected on aesthetic theory. He's still really well respected in ethics. He's just, like, it's like almost everything that he tried to do, he was just awesome at it. Yeah, Corinne.
Does he, like, in the beginning, does he kind of, like, shade John Locke?
A little bit. A little bit. Although I would say, like, he's probably kind of friendly to the way that Locke is working. But he identifies Locke as an example of a style of philosophy that it's not clear how he feels towards it. This is what he nails down in section 1 of his Enquiry. And this is about these kind of like two kinds of philosophy. Have I used that before, the phi for philosophy? That's the Greek letter phi. It's the first letter in philosophy. So, like, yeah, two kinds of philosophy. That's just a shorthand. Two kinds of philosophy, and the two kinds of philosophy that he identifies are the practical sort and the abstract sort. He names John Locke as one of the practitioners of the abstract sort. And maybe after having like read Locke, you might think to yourself, like, yeah, definitely. And maybe you might think to yourself, like, I think all the people that we've read this semester are of the abstract sort. And I'd be like, yeah, they kind of are. Then there's the practical sort. And he gives some examples of those. And yeah, if there's this question of like, is he throwing a little bit of shade on Locke, or is he throwing a little bit of shade on the abstract kind of philosophy? It's the other way around? You thought he was throwing shade on this one?
Yeah, but I thought he was saying that John Locke was the practical kind.
Check your text. See if you can find this. My recollection is he calls out Aristotle and Locke, specifically on the abstract kind. He names Cicero as an example of the abstract, of the practical kind. But I think this division still kind of exists a little bit today. It exists within philosophy, but also like other ways that Hume is talking about these different styles of philosophy still echoes today in some interesting ways. The practical philosophy sometimes gets referred to as moral philosophy, and that's not like having to do with ethics necessarily and like how to do the right thing. It's just about doing things. Like when Aristotle talks about moral virtues are the virtues that have to be habituated in a sort of kind of like a bodily practice. And he also talks about intellectual virtues. Those things don't get habituated. So this idea of like moral philosophy as kind of functioning according to habit or according to like doing, the kind of like doing of praxis, or there's sometimes like a lot of appeal to sentiment. You get the impression sometimes as he gets to talking about this, it's a style of philosophy that is very accessible. This is one of the pluses that he talks about it. He says, this practical style of philosophy is crazy accessible. Anybody can pick it up and get something out of it. I like to think of this in terms of, you ever go to a bookstore? Bookstore, like sometimes coffee shops, I don't know if you guys like have seen this, sometimes coffee shops have like a big room in the back where there's books. Books are like the internet, but harder. Yeah, it's like the internet, but harder. It's like a thick tablet where you have to turn the pages. And there are like stores that sell all these. And if you go to any big chain bookstore, there's a philosophy section. It's inevitably like between the religion and the New Age spiritual stuff, which like bums me out to no end. But if you go into this section, you'll find a smattering of like kind of 20th century, like big names in 20th century contemporary philosophy. You'll probably find some of the greatest hits from the history of philosophy too. You may very well even find David Hume's Enquiry Concerning Human Understanding, which he, again, published in 1748, but it was not the first draft of this. He worked this out in a different book that he wrote called A Treatise on Human Nature that he started working on when he was in college, like around your age. And by the time he graduated, he was like, I'm done with this treatise on human nature, and he publishes it, and according to his own account, he says, it falls stillborn from the press. Nobody read it, and those few people who did, they just absolutely savaged it in the reviews. And David Hume was like, well, back to the drawing board, I guess. But he doesn't completely change his ideas. He says, I think the basic idea, the basic approach in the treatise was right, but it was too long, so he condenses it. It was too hard to understand, so he makes it like a lot easier to understand. Did you encounter David Hume as a very clear writer?
Yes.
Me too. Yeah, even compared to Locke. It's just like, that David Hume guy, I'm pretty sure what he's saying at every turn. So he gets a lot clearer in his writing. He gets a lot clearer in his argumentation, kind of tightens things up, and publishes the Enquiry. It's much smaller. All right. So where was I? Oh, yeah, in the Barnes & Noble, in the philosophy section, you'll find some contemporary stuff. You'll find greatest hits from the history of philosophy. And then you'll find this other kind of, self-help kind of stuff. Like the worst of it. And it's always there. It's always in the Barnes & Noble philosophy section. I find some goddamn copy of The Secret. Are you guys familiar with this book? The Secret is, I don't know if I'm like enough of a gatekeeper to say that it's not philosophy. If it is, it's bad philosophy. It's terrible. It's really, really badly done. Here's like the big secret behind The Secret. If you envision positive things will happen to you. It's like make a vision board and that'll help it come true. Now maybe there's something psychological to like this idea of like if you actually think through what it would be like to succeed in the things that you're trying to do, maybe you'll get a clearer idea of like what the path to success looks like. But it's not magic, right? And people who are starving in refugee camps, they're just not like failing to visualize a sandwich good enough. Like it's like that's not their problem. Magical thinking?
No,
Oh.
one word. It's like,
There are some other folks that do this too. Lou Marinoff has a book out called Plato Not Prozac. That's just kind of like how to make your life better through philosophy. And it's not through the doing of philosophy. It's basically just kind of like test your intuitions. It's like, what do you think? Like, here's a dilemma. Like, where do you go with it? And like you say, like, that's the one that I pick. And Lou Marinoff says, okay, well then you're a blankist. And he gives you a label that you can stick on yourself. And you're like, now I understand philosophy. But you didn't change your mind. And there was no thought process involved. It's what some folks will refer to as kind of like an edifying style of philosophy that just kind of reinforces whatever sorts of biases or sentiments that you came in with. The way that he talks about this with respect to like moral philosophy and picking out folks like Cicero, for example, is they try to write in very pretty ways that makes it seem like what they're saying is true because it seems beautiful. Or they'll talk about, for example, moral virtue in a very beautiful way. And they'll try to make moral virtue look really, really attractive. And then they'll talk about moral vice. And they'll try to make that look really unattractive. And in the process, you'll start to figure out, like, I want to be virtuous and not vicious. And it's like, yeah, okay, good. But that's a very different kind of a style of philosophy. It's useful. It gets put into practice immediately every day. But it's not very rigorous. And a certain sort of skepticism, especially regarding the way that it kind of makes appeals to habit and sentiment, maybe is worth kind of thinking about. And Cicero's like a brilliant, don't get me wrong, Cicero's a brilliant thinker. But if you read through him kind of like looking for something brand new that wasn't in the history of philosophy before he came along, you're probably not going to find it. Cicero's like a mishmash of a bunch of other styles of thinker that came before him. We might even say this about like a lot of the Hellenistic thinkers, the Stoics, the Epicureans, maybe even the skeptics a little bit, that they're all talking about lifestyles and not so much making these sorts of abstract arguments. This is perhaps a style of doing philosophy. It's not particularly well respected in the schools. It wasn't particularly well respected in the philosophy departments of David Hume's day. I don't know if you can tell by the way I'm talking about it. It's not particularly well respected in philosophy departments today. And perhaps I have like an unfair sort of an academic bias against it, and you should take everything that I say about this with a grain of salt, because you've seen my syllabus. It's all this kind of philosophy, which is like way more rigorous. And this involves things like metaphysics. And it's super rigorous. No appeals to habit or sentiment there. So maybe we're kind of inclined to think that that's the better kind of philosophy. But Hume is kind of like equally critical and praising of both kinds. Yeah, Pearson.
This is kind of similar to continental
I don't think so. I think continental and analytic philosophy are working. It's a way of talking about two different kinds of philosophy, but it's a slightly different approach. I think that there are probably some analytic philosophers who would say, yeah, this is the difference between, that's the continental philosophy. And they probably wouldn't even say that it's practical. They'd be like, continental philosophy is like, it's all the bad stuff of the practical kind of philosophy and none of the good stuff. But I think we can do a similar thing with continental and analytic philosophy that we can with this practical and abstract kind of philosophy, which is to identify that like each of them can be done badly, and when they're done badly, they're bad. And each of them can be done well, and when they're done well, they're pretty good. And some of this maybe has to do with figuring out like what's the right tool for the job, and like understanding how to use them well and use them in the right sorts of circumstances. So with continental and analytic philosophy, if you guys are unfamiliar with this distinction, it's more cliquey and cultural than anything else. But if you had to kind of pin down what it was, if you ask the analytic philosophers, what is continental philosophy like? They'll say it's like poetry and just people talking about their feelings, and there's no rigor of like analysis or argument or anything like that. They won't pin their words down and make them mean just one thing. They talk in metaphors, and they kind of like use language in a loose sort of a way. If you ask the continental philosophers what the analytic philosophers are doing, they'll say they're very rigorous and they're very precise, but they don't talk about anything interesting at all. They just play word games. Not that they're nerds, but they like, I don't know if you've ever seen it. Maybe you've seen it in this classroom where somebody gets like so precise in their analysis of what's going on that you're just like, I don't even know what you're talking about anymore. Sometimes continental philosophers will also identify that like the thoughts that we're trying to think right now are the first time anybody's thinking these thoughts, and we don't have the words for these thoughts just yet, so we have to kind of talk around them. We have to be a little bit poetic. We have to loosen up language a little bit in order to make this work. If you're coining a concept for the first time, that style of philosophy is required. If we do have the concepts available, and if we can pin them down and make them static and you do some rigorous thinking, then we can do some analytic philosophy. And a similar sort of thing is going on here, where Hume is saying the practical applications of this practical kind of philosophy are awesome. Another thing that's awesome about this practical kind of philosophy is you can't make really big mistakes with it. If you like stray too far from like what is intuitively plausible, like that kind of habit and sentiment, that little gut check will kind of be like, that's not right. If you start like doing moral philosophy and the conclusions that you come to is like, therefore, murder is not only morally permissible, but morally obligatory. Everybody start murdering now. You might think to yourself, like, something must have gone wrong with my argument there, right? Because that's a little wackadoo. But down here in the abstract kind of philosophy, we don't have that kind of gut check that we can kind of fall back on. A good example, I think, for like the abstract. So I mentioned Cicero gets named here as a practitioner of the practical kind. Aristotle. Corinne, did you find the thing?
Yeah, you were right.
Okay. Aristotle and Locke get mentioned as practitioners of the abstract kind. Another great example of like some of the things that I think Hume is complaining about with the abstract style of philosophy might be Bishop Berkeley, another one of his contemporaries, like same century more or less, also in England. And Berkeley was also an empiricist, like most of the British empiricists, but a radically different kind of empiricist. Berkeley said, there's just ideas. That's all. That's all that there are ideas. And there's no matter. This is a rare form of empiricist who is like not a materialist at all. He's a monist. Berkeley's a monist. He says there's only one kind of thing, and it's ideas. Summed up in this phrase, SAS percipi, to be is to be perceived. If you've ever heard this old philosophical chestnut of like, if a tree falls in the forest and no one's around, does it make a sound? That's like totally Berkeley right there. And Berkeley says, no, if the tree falling does not get perceived, then the tree does not fall. To be is to be perceived. Which raises all kinds of like weird sort of like, so if I like shut my eyes, did you guys like stop existing? And Berkeley would be like, well, it's not like other people are perceiving it. And then he tosses in just for good measure at the end, and God is always perceiving everything. So there's like some consistency throughout the world. But Berkeley is making these metaphysical arguments, and they're actually relatively tight. It's kind of hard to pick out like where does he go wrong, or it's hard to disprove him. In a famous exchange, one of his contemporaries came up to him and said, like, here's how I refute your theory, and just like kicks a rock and goes like, duh, there's matter, dude, obviously. But that's not much of a response. Because like somebody like Berkeley would say, like, you showed me that there was like, I got a sense impression from what was happening, but maybe God was lightning bolting those in my head. Like, I don't know that there's actually any matter. This could be the Matrix, right? This could be evil deceiver kind of land. There's no reason to suppose that there's matter at all. And David Hume is looking at this sort of thing, and he's wondering, who gives a shit? Is there any way to tell who's right on these questions? And does it matter? Like, are you going to live your life differently if there's matter or not? So there seems to be no practical applications to this style of philosophy. And furthermore, while its arguments are rigorous, they're confusing and they're dense. And this makes it hard to read, and it makes it unpopular amongst the masses and undergraduates. And these alone are not reasons to like disregard the abstract style of philosophy. Just because something's hard doesn't mean that it's not worth doing. And even the fact that there seems to be no practical application to it doesn't suggest that we shouldn't do it. Because not everything is done for like its practical. Some things are done for their own sake. And Hume says this about the abstract style of philosophy as well. It's like a workout for your mind. And that's not to say that everybody needs to do it. I know people who run ultramarathons. I know people who are in CrossFit cults. They're like working out their bodies in some like really, really intense ways, and I'm looking at them like, good for you. If you enjoy that, have fun. Not for me. I, on the other hand, might sit down and read some metaphysics for like a couple of hours at a go, and they'll look at that and they'll be like, you are really exercising your mind. And I'm like, I know, right? It's thrilling. We have a whole cult of people who do the same thing. And they're like, yeah, not for me. And Hume's about the same kind of thing, where he's like, this is a great way to exercise your mind. It's enjoyable for its own sake. It's also useful for some practical applications, but indirectly. It kind of like grounds the practical application stuff. He uses this example of like painters who take anatomy classes. Anybody here a visual arts student? No. If I'm not mistaken, they do. Like if you're taking a figure painting class, there's going to be some anatomy in that class. You're going to learn like how the human skeleton is shaped, and then how the muscles kind of sit over it, like are kind of stretched over the skeleton, how the layers of fat are layered over the muscles, and then how the skin is layered over the fat. And this is going to give you like a clearer idea of what the human figure is like and how it works, and you're going to be able to paint it better or draw it better. Frequently, students are kind of wondering aloud to their professors, why do I have to learn this? I'm never going to use it. And the answer sometimes is, you don't know what you're going to be able to use, right? Like, why are we doing pure research if we don't know what the applications are? Well, we don't know what the applications are yet. Maybe we'll figure it out. And also, maybe it grounds our practices in a kind of a theoretical unity in a way that is really, really useful and really, really helpful. But it's indirectly useful. The abstract philosophy is useful insofar as it's in service to a practical style of philosophy in that case. So Hume is kind of like, he's a little bit up in the air on both of these. He can think of like reasons why each one is good and reasons why each one is bad. Some of the really, really awful things with the abstract or the metaphysical philosophy, style of doing philosophy, involve the denseness and difficulty of the arguments, and that coupled with this fact that there's no kind of gut check that you can refer it back to like see if you've made any mistakes. So he warns us against, like, in doing this abstract or metaphysical style of philosophy, you could make huge errors and have no idea that you had made those errors. And that's maybe a problem. And on top of that, sometimes people will hide behind the denseness, and they'll use big words and jargon to kind of disguise their bad arguments and make them look better than they actually are. Hume is complaining that this was like a problem in the academic discourse of the day, that all of the academicians, all of the people who were practicing this abstract metaphysical style of philosophy, they weren't really making very clear arguments. They were making the arguments as unclear as possible and hiding behind all of the jargon and all of the complexity in order to make it look like what they were saying was way smarter than it actually was. Good thing we got past that, and that's not a problem for academic writing anymore. That's sarcasm. So, yeah, two kinds of philosophy, the practical, the abstract. Does Hume prefer one to the other? No, not really. In fact, what he says is what we want here is we want a balanced. We want a kind of a mixed life. is actually the phrase that he uses. We want a mixed life. A little bit from column A, a little bit from column B. Do the practical philosophy in all of those circumstances where it belongs. Do the abstract philosophy in all of those circumstances perhaps where it belongs, if there are any circumstances where it belongs. Perhaps at best all we can say about abstract philosophy is that it's enjoyable and nobody gets hurt as long as you practice it responsibly. But it seems like what we're looking for is a mixed life. And he also notes that this has come under attack of late, and there are certain kinds of styles that are kind of taking over European philosophy that are kind of drifting more in this direction and critiquing this one. And Hume says we can't let those criticisms pass without some sort of response. And that's what the rest of the Enquiry is. It's a response to kind of trying to figure out, is this useful at all? Should anybody do this style of philosophy? And then he proceeds to do that style of philosophy, more or less. We want a mixed life. We want to use the right tools for the right job. And in order to do that, we need to know how the tools work. So we need a science of the mind. We've heard this before many, many times. This, I think, is the third time we've had somebody refer to, we need a science of the mind. Margaret Cavendish mentioned that sort of thing. John Locke mentioned this sort of thing. Here it is, David Hume saying the same sort of thing. We need a science of the mind. What will eventually become psychology, but it's psychology being practiced before there is a psychology. It's psychology being practiced by philosophers. So there's an awful lot of kind of first-hand accounts of what's going on in my mind when I think. That's this style of psychology that's being done, which is a very different style of psychology than what gets done today under the name of psychology. All right, that's section 1, 2 kinds of philosophy and what it is that Hume is up to in this project. Section 2, the origin of ideas. Déjà vu, right? Locke did the same thing. First, he talked about what he's up to. He gave a little bit of preamble and he says, what is it that I'm up to? And then the next thing he does is he says, where do our ideas come from? And starts talking about where our ideas come from. And Locke said, our ideas come from 2 places. What are those 2 places? Locke said sensation and reflection. Hume says the origin of our ideas is they come from 2 places. And those 2 places are impressions and impressions and ideas. This is actually slightly different. Sometimes he talks about this this is thought or thinking. Some we might think about this as something kind of like reflection. You might be tempted to try to map this onto how Locke broke this up. Sensation and reflection, but he's actually up to something very, very different. The fact that he calls these ideas and these impressions hopefully gives you some sense of where he's diverging from what Locke was saying. Locke thought that both sensation and reflection could give you ideas. You could get ideas directly from sensation. You could get simple ideas of sensation from one sense, from multiple senses. Remember that whole conversation? Here Locke is saying, well, we have impressions and then we have ideas. So are the impressions ideas? And Hume's like, no, the impressions aren't ideas. They're not ideas yet. Every idea is, in fact, it's a copy of some impression. And the impressions are the things that you are currently experiencing right now. If you have to try to remember it. Here we go. You guys all see this? This red tablet case? Red, 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 red. You can't see it now, right? But can you remember it? Because you have a copy of the impression in your mind. Then we can bring it back. I have another impression. Is it still there? But it's a little less vivid, right? It's a little hazier. This idea that ideas are copies of impressions is a little bit different than what Locke was doing, and it ends up being fairly important to the way that this kind of parses out in the rest of Hume's system. One more thing I'll get on the board, just so that I don't have to do it at our next meeting. There's more to be said about this, including like what's going on with meaningless ideas. Are there any meaningless ideas? And Hume is like, there are totally meaningless ideas, totally confused ideas that people like, they use the words, but those words don't represent anything. And the way that you know that those ideas are actually meaningless is that when you try to trace it back to some sort of impression that caused it. There is no impression that caused it. Example of an idea that was not caused by any impression?
Is that what he's talking about with color?
So he'll get to that eventually, and there are all kinds of like fun little thought experiments about what if I've never experienced a color? Can I have an idea of that color? And he's like, no, you can't do that. Think about it. If you can't think of it now, maybe we'll open up our next meeting with this like, what's an example of an idea that has no impression that gave rise to it and therefore is confused and meaningless? The last thing that I'll mention here is what happens in section 3, which is the associations between ideas. How is it that I move in thought from one idea to the next? Locke talked about this like it was just a function of like shifting your attention. But Hume is talking about this in like a slightly different way where it's just kind of like you go kind of naturally from one idea to the next, such that like if I do like, there we go. You went from that idea to the next idea and it kind of flowed naturally. So what's up with that? How is it that like we kind of go in predictable sorts of routes from one idea to another? And this, instead of getting from like simple ideas to complex ideas, which is the route that Locke takes, with Hume it's all like, okay, so we have sensory impressions, those get copied and become ideas in our mind. And then what ends up happening is there's this kind of flow from one idea to the next. And that's our thought process. So if I want to have a science of the mind, if I want to understand how it is that my mind works, if I want a user's manual such that I'm using the right tools for the right job, I've got to look really, really carefully at how it is that my mind moves in thought from one idea to the next, such that that movement could be a reliable one. And that's where we'll pick up our next meeting. Thanks.